Order. The Foreign Affairs Committee is meeting today for a public evidence session on our inquiry into Israel-Palestine conflict. And today we are very grateful to be able to hear from NGOs working on the ground in Gaza. A number of today's witnesses have got first-hand experience, some very recent, of the situation in Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territories. So I think it's only right to tell those watching today's session that they should be aware that some of the accounts that they may hear may include information which may cause distress. So let's begin by getting everybody to introduce themselves. I wonder, Anna, would you mind introducing yourself first?
Good afternoon. My name is Anna Halford. I'm currently emergency coordinator for MSF based in Brussels, so for the operations in the occupied Palestinian territories. And I left Gaza for the last time in January.
Okay. And Rohan?
Very nice to meet you all today. My name is Rohan Talbot. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Campaigns at Medical Aid for Palestinians, and I'm based in London.
And Tanya?
Hello, everyone. My name is Tanya Haj-Hassan. I'm a pediatric intensive care doctor who's worked in Gaza multiple times over the last decade, but most recently twice with Medical Aid for Palestinians as part of the emergency medical teams, most recently February and March of this year.
And Shaina.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Shaina Lowe, and I'm the Communication Advisor for the Norwegian Refugee Council's Palestine Mission. We're an independent, impartial, and neutral humanitarian organization that focuses on displacement and operates in around 40 countries. We're also the FCDO's largest INGO partner in the occupied Palestinian territory, and we're a UK-registered charity. And we provide a range of services, including shelter, water and hygiene, sanitation, protection, legal aid, and education. And part of our work in Gaza includes coordinating different shelter actors working together on the shelter response. I'm currently speaking to you from Amman, Jordan, as Israel has stopped issuing humanitarian visas for humanitarian workers. Thank you.
Thank you. What I wanted to start with really was just to, and to a certain extent, and you've been introducing yourself broadly, which is really helpful, but I wanted to know what work you have been doing, particularly in Gaza and the West Bank. And then I think also given what's going on in relation to the regional war and the way that the eyes of the world have now recently just turned away from Gaza and the West Bank, what exactly has been happening in the last few days. I don't know who wants to start with that. Should I start with you, Tanya?
Yes, certainly. So most recently I went with Medical Aid for Palestinians. I worked as a clinician. I was based last year in the middle area of Gaza at a hospital called Al-Aqsa, and then most recently this year in Al-Nasser Hospital. But the period I was there overlapped with the ceasefire. So I was able to travel and visit some of the pediatric hospitals with the Medical Aid for Palestinians team to assess the needs of critically ill or injured children in Gaza, because the institutions that I used to teach at that specialized in pediatric intensive care and had specialized units have, for the most part, been destroyed. So we kind of went around Gaza City and areas north of the middle area to examine what was left to care for critically ill children, because the bed occupancy of the units that did have those services was constantly at full capacity. So your second question was in light of regional development.
It's gone off the news, and it's not like things aren't happening. And so I think it's important that we, at the beginning of this session, put such information as we have before the public, because they won't see it on the front page of the newspapers in the way that they might have if there hadn't been the war with Iran.
Certainly. And I think this is just, it's the most recent development of turning off the lights on what's happening in Gaza, because, for the last almost 20 months now, international journalists have not been let in, independent investigators have not been let in. And so humanitarian workers are some of the only independent witnesses on the ground. And we consistently emerge sharing harrowing details that are morally and legally sufficient to warrant a response. And we haven't seen that response. And now for the last week, to see so many of the crimes we've been seeing for the last 20 months continue, but not receive public attention. For example, Al-Nasser Hospital, where I was based, it's the last hospital fully standing in Gaza that offers a lot of the specialized services that are needed for the population. It was Gaza's second largest hospital after Al-Shifa Hospital. Al-Shifa Hospital was destroyed. Nasser Hospital was bombed while I was there. It was shelled by a drone attack, killing 2 patients and injuring several others, the floor immediately above where I was working in the emergency department. And since then, there have been subsequent attacks on Nasser Hospital, and currently it's essentially encircled. So it is almost like a tiny island that's not technically for evacuation, but staff are unable to reach the hospital safely. Many staff and patients have evacuated, and that is devastating. Some international NGOs have withdrawn from that hospital where they were providing essential services, and maybe MSF can speak more to that as well. And for us, for myself, having worked there and seen the intensive care unit, the pediatric intensive care unit, they have a specialized intensive care unit for children filled with injured children at full capacity. They've since extended it to have 3 additional beds. But I hear from my colleagues on the ground, the Palestinian pediatric doctors working in the ICU, that it's been at full capacity ever since I left. And every time one of the injured children dies, they immediately fill the bed because there's a queue of children that are waiting for the beds and that are dying as a consequence of not having access to one of the few remaining pediatric intensive care beds inside Gaza. So Nasser Hospital is currently at the same risk that virtually every public hospital in Gaza has encountered in the last 20 months. Al-Shifa, Al-Nasser Pediatric Hospital, where I used to teach, was completely leveled. You might recall Al-Nasser Hospital because it's different than Al-Nasser, just to clarify for those listening. Al-Nasser was the only general pediatric hospital in Gaza. You might remember the news last year of babies decomposing in their beds after the staff was forced by the Israeli military to evacuate and promised that the critical infants that required expert evacuation would be evacuated, and they were not. And they subsequently died and decomposed in their beds. This was all over the international media. That hospital is now leveled. I visited the site of that hospital. It's adjacent hospital, also a subspecialty pediatric, not a general, but a subspecialty pediatric hospital, where children with blood cancers like leukemia were treated, where children with chronic diseases were treated. Any child who needed subspecialty care would have been treated there. Rantisi was used as a military base for the Israeli forces. The Turkish Friendship Cancer Hospital, the only specialized cancer hospital in Gaza, was also used as a base by the Israeli military and subsequently flattened. There no longer is a cancer hospital in Gaza. Cancer services were moved to the European Gaza Hospital, and in the last couple of weeks, the European hospital was encircled, forcibly evacuated after being attacked several times, and is now used as a command and control center by the Israeli military. So I honestly don't know how and if cancer patients in Gaza are receiving care at the moment. There were an estimated 11,000 people with cancer in Gaza prior to October 2023, and that applies across diseases. The dialysis centers were destroyed most recently in the last month. One of the main specialized dialysis centers in the north was destroyed. The Nasser Dialysis Center was destroyed. We saw it every day. It was charred. It was across the plot of land that was used as a mass grave when Nasser Hospital was besieged by the Israeli military. So I'm trying to paint a picture of a healthcare system that has been systematically targeted and destroyed. And from my perspective, it's a facet of ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, but that's not only from my personal experience and testimony. It's consistent across healthcare workers who have worked and humanitarian workers who've worked on the ground, and as well as UN experts and international human rights groups that have concluded that Israel is committing extermination and genocide against the Palestinian people, and most recently demonstrated by a UN report on attacks on healthcare and healthcare workers. At least 1,500 healthcare workers have been killed to date in Gaza, including several of my previous students. So I had taught them when they were medical students. And I can tell your viewers right now, these are some of the most dedicated healthcare workers that I have ever encountered. I'll end there just to give others an opportunity to answer your question. But I think the most recent international events just mean that these same atrocities continue to be committed. They just are being committed without the world's watch.
Thank you. Anna, are you able to give us an up-to-date picture of what's happening at the moment? Do you have sources that might be able to tell us what's happened over the last week, perhaps particularly?
Very much so.
I don't want to constrict you if there's other things you want to say, but I think last week is particularly important.
Thank you. So, Médecins Sans Frontières, so Doctors Without Borders, we've worked in Gaza since before the war, but since the beginning of the war, obviously the form and the scale of our operations has changed radically. We currently have around 1,000 Palestinian colleagues. We work with a further 1,500 or so Ministry of Health staff, and we have 30 to 35 international staff on the ground as well. We currently work in 3 of the very few remaining functional hospitals. We work in 7 clinics. We run our own field hospitals. So we are providing as best we can a significant portion, in conjunction with other colleagues and other NGOs working in the medical field, a significant portion of the only remaining healthcare. Because what Dr. Haj-Hassan has referred to as the systematic targeting is absolutely the case. There is no other word for it. We have watched the dismantling of a system. It is impossible to have gone from the number of hospitals and clinics and primary healthcare centres that there were to the number that there are now without concluding that this was, at least in part, if not in whole, entirely intentional. In the last week, understanding what is going on has been complicated slightly by the fact that internet in northern Gaza and in the middle area of Gaza was cut. I do not use those words lightly. It was cut. It was not accidentally destroyed. There was simultaneous, deliberate destruction to 2 separate lines. And so, at least for our teams, and I imagine those of others, that is part of our contingency planning. We are able to communicate with our own satellite backup systems. But this is relying on electricity or fuel, which is also systematically restricted. It just makes operations and coordinating the movements of our colleagues and goods within an active war zone just that little bit more complicated. The irony, since the escalation in the region, is that actually some of our colleagues have had a slightly quieter few days as the military attention, especially the aerial military attention, has been directed clearly elsewhere. There are still 2 major sets of ground operations in Gaza, one in the north and one in Khan Yunis. Khan Yunis is in so if the strip is like this, Khan Yunis is a very large middle section. And it's important to understand that at this point, more than 70% of the entire territory of Gaza is under one or both of 2 regimes. One is a military exclusion zone around the border, so the entire terrestrial border includes a section of X kilometers ranging from 500 meters to 3 kilometers, where it is impossible to go and remain safe or indeed alive. The other part is covered by the so-called evacuation orders, whereby instructions are given by the Israeli forces and authorities to everybody within certain areas which have been delimited into blocks to move out of those areas for their own safety. There is never a point at which you can return to those zones. They're never lifted. They are never rescinded. And so they just continue to accumulate. And so that means that the vast majority of Gaza's population is forced into a little tiny strip along the coastal edge, which leads to a level of disease associated with proximity, but also a lack of access, which is chronic. Dr. Haj-Hassan was referring to the difficulties to access, for example, Nasser Hospital, where MSF runs both a maternity and paediatric unit and a burns and orthopedic trauma unit. We work with around 60 colleagues in that burns and trauma unit, to just give you an idea. Every single movement to and from that hospital currently has to be coordinated with the Israeli military authorities. If they don't answer an email or answer the phone, point in order, there is no communications for the fast day. What do you do? It leaves us with a choice of accessing healthcare structures to provide care to patients, or just not at all, or not turning up, or being able to refer patients from mass casualty incidents. The ICRC Field Hospital, so the International Committee of the Red Cross, further south in Rafah, has received more patients since the opening of the so-called distribution system by Israel than they have received since that hospital opened. So that system began on, and I use system with the heaviest possible air quotes.
Do you mind if I cut across you just for a moment?
Please.
Because we're going to cover that specifically,
right, okay.
But if we can come to it a little bit later.
No. So just it's just representative that and perhaps I will end in the same place that Dr. Haj-Hassan offered, is that the escalation in the region will inevitably cause more suffering for even more civilians. But the situation in Gaza has not stopped. It has not changed. There is still what amounts to a total blockade, which has been running since the 2nd of March. There is food only under this system going in, and there is a desultory trickle of available other goods which is allowed in. It has been claimed that Israel has lifted that blockade because they have opened the corridor. No, they've opened one corridor where they know extremely well that there were no goods stored. So the Israel corridor is open. Sure, you can bring stuff in from Ashdod or Jerusalem, but you cannot bring stuff in from Jordan and Egypt, which is where the majority of humanitarian aid is stored. So MSF, we have had 4 trucks in since the 27th of May. We have been able to, part of that was some local purchase, which we scrambled to do at the last minute when that was able to be done in Israel. We have more than 100 trucks waiting, and these contain all of the essential drugs and material and equipment to provide the surgery that we are doing, or provide the care for chronically ignored diseases that we are doing. So we cannot, as a medical organisation, run operations based on this is what we need this week. We need some kind of forward planning so that we can adapt to the continuing needs. The scale of need is off the charts. It is virtually without precedent for what we have seen.
Thank you. I wondered, Rohan, if you could also tell us about what you understand the situation on the ground is in Gaza, and particularly at the moment. But I think also because MAP has also you have a footprint in the West Bank too. Could you tell us what's going on in the West Bank as well? And perhaps we ought to have a little bit of evidence in relation to that. And as I say, generally, but then also just to make sure that we're covering specifically what's happened in the very recent past.
Yes, of course. So perhaps I'll start in the West Bank, because it is important that we don't forget the situation there. MAP, of course, has been working in the West Bank for more than 30 years, and we have a permanent staff there who operate a range of programmes and partnerships across mental health, women's and children's health, the rights of persons with disability, and of course emergency care and primary care. And many MPs in this House will have visited, for example, our mobile clinics as part of delegations that we take. Over the same period of the devastating attacks on Gaza, the situation in the West Bank is also unprecedented in the level of Israeli military and settler violence meted out against Palestinian populations. Of course, most harshly hit are those communities that we would consider to be at the sharp end of the occupation. Those are Bedouin communities and herder communities in, for example, the Jordan Valley and Hebron, but also, most importantly, refugee communities. We've seen the complete emptying out of Jenin refugee camp. An entire refugee camp is now entirely depopulated as a result of Israel's military attacks on that camp.
How big was the population there?
It was more than 20,000 people.
Yeah.
Now displaced. I think there are more than that now across Jenin refugee camp, Tulkarm. Was it 40,000 across? Okay. Tulkarm and other communities up in the north have now been essentially completely depopulated, and their populations dispersed and unable to return.
And that population has been settled in those refugee camps for how long?
For more than 75 years. And I mean, it's worth bearing in mind as well that when we talk about Gaza, we're talking about a population that is more than 70% refugees as well. So we have to bear in mind that the origins of this go far, far back, more than 70 years. So the situation in the West Bank has been really desperate. We have been doing what we can to support, for example, the provision of emergency care, ensuring that there is local availability of essential needs for emergency care practitioners, because Israel has also very severely restricted movement across the whole of the West Bank. And when previously it was possible, for example, to mount an aid response when there was a crisis or an increase in violence across the West Bank, now we've discovered that essentially we have to store things locally in order to be able to make sure that people can get it, because access across the West Bank is much more restricted. And notably, as soon as the attacks on Iran began and Iran's response over the weekend, the West Bank was placed in a total lockdown. No movement through any checkpoint was allowed. Our mobile clinic couldn't reach communities that need primary health care, etc.
And just again, for the public who perhaps might not have been to the West Bank, when you say there's no movement through checkpoints, I mean, how many checkpoints are there now on the West Bank?
More than 350 checkpoints and barriers across the West Bank, and even now some of those restrictions have started to be lifted, but only slightly, and therefore, you know, it's not only about being able to access at all, but the speed at which people can access, particularly emergency care, be able to go to appointments for cancer care, chronic diseases, etc. All of these things are massively restricted, and the impact on people's lives and health are really severe. Maybe switching over to Gaza as well. I mean, I can endorse everything that you've heard. That's the same experience of our colleagues in Gaza. We have a permanent team of colleagues operating on the ground who report this as being the darkest and most terrifying period of the attacks so far. And in particular, there was very significant fear amongst our colleagues when the internet went out a few days ago about what was to come, and of course the attacks continued. And as you rightly say, media attention has waned, but 50 to 60 people are killed by bombardment every day. We have continued to see people killed at these so-called aided distribution points that we'll talk about later, and the situation is completely catastrophic. And obviously we and others here are likely to focus on healthcare, but I just want to emphasize homes, healthcare, refugee camps, universities, schools, even the land that people need to cultivate in order to survive in Gaza. Everything has come under attack. Everything. There isn't a single square meter of space in Gaza that is safe for people. These 2 million people who are now, as Anna said, crammed into a tiny strip of land. It is the total dismantling of society, the total dismantling and annihilation of Gaza's population. That's what we are witness to. And my fear, and the fear of my colleagues on the ground, is that as attention starts to wane because of the conflict between Israel and Iran, this is firstly not going away, but they worry that they and their colleagues and their friends and their families are going to die in the dark.
Yes, I hear you. Shaina, would you mind also just telling us about what I mean? Without obviously we're hearing quite a clear picture, But I mean, if there's anything, and we're going to have lots of questions, but I mean, but if there's anything particular that you feel would be useful to add, please, would you mind sort of speaking generally about the state of Gaza, the West Bank, and as I say, particularly what's happening at the moment?
Yeah, thank you. In terms of Gaza, one thing that I would really like to stress and point out is the shelter crisis that is ongoing. We've had 665,000 Palestinians displaced since March 18th, when Israel broke the ceasefire. Many of those people have had to flee with only what they can carry in their hands. And so while we were able to make a large effort in terms of providing emergency shelter relief during the ceasefire, most of that work has now been erased as people have been forced to flee and forced to leave the shelter materials that they had been given behind as they fled. For many of these people, this is multiple displacements over the last 20 months. While Israel has allowed this trickle of flour, nutrition materials, and medicines to enter through traditional channels since the end of May, no shelter materials have been allowed inside of Gaza since the siege was tightened to a complete siege on March 2nd. And so that means that over 1.1 million Palestinians in Gaza, and we believe that this is a gross underestimate, are in need of shelter assistance. We ran out of tents. All shelter partners ran out of tents by mid-April. And just so you know, NRC alone, the Norwegian Refugee Council, has close to 900,000 pounds worth of shelter materials donated by the British government, waiting in Jordan and Egypt to be allowed entry into Gaza. This would be life-saving assistance and provide assistance to tens of thousands of people. It includes 2,700 tents, which are essential, especially as the sun gets hotter and people are exposed to the incredible heat and humidity that Gaza is known for in the summer.
May I pause you there? I mean, the Israelis object to these tents because of what we've heard, but I mean, would you mind just putting it on the record about the tent poles and the colours and so on?
Yes, so Israel has imposed arbitrary restrictions in terms of tents and what we may bring in. These tents, I believe, would have been pre-approved were Israel allowing the flow of aid at this point. And so these are tents that would have been allowed in prior to March 2nd when the siege was imposed. But since March 2nd, almost nothing has entered Gaza via traditional humanitarian channels. And so, but we have seen over the course of these 20 months, arbitrary restrictions and denials in terms of bringing in shelter equipment, but not only shelter equipment, but all sorts of equipment. We had, during the ceasefire, trucks loaded with educational materials that were denied entry and access to Gaza when children in Gaza have been deprived of traditional education for 20 months at this point. A colleague of mine told me just last week that her 7-year-old daughter still does not know how to read because she has no school. These are impacts that are going to last much longer than the destruction. This is generational setbacks that are going to bring the Palestinians back to a place I don't think any of us could have imagined. Many of you may know that Palestinians have one of the highest literacy rates, are extremely high academic achievers, and incredibly talented and skilled. And we are seeing a generation that is being lost because of the denial of access to education, because of the denial of access to basic necessities, food, shelter, water. In addition to the work that we do on shelter, NRC has also been providing clean drinking water to tens of thousands of Palestinians each day. But this is also at risk due to the fuel shortages that the other speakers spoke about. These fuel shortages are going to have an immense impact, are having an immense impact, and will continue to have an immense impact on the humanitarian response, not just in terms of telecommunications, but also in terms of running regular infrastructure, powering bakeries, hospitals, and so on. In terms of the work that we've been able to do since March 18th, when the ceasefire was broken by Israel, it's been really limited because we cannot guarantee the safety of our staff members when they move around. And so most of our staff are restricted to the offices or their homes and are forced to do their work remotely. We can do some of this with the soft services that we provide, like legal aid, checking in with the temporary learning centers, and checking in with parents and providing psychosocial support to them as well as to teachers. But we're tremendously limited in what we're able to do because it simply is not safe for humanitarians to move around when the notification system, which was working prior to the ceasefire, not well, has failed to be reactivated. And so there's very limited movement available to our staff. If I may just turn very briefly to the West Bank, we too are concerned about vulnerable communities like the Bedouins and herder communities that Rohan spoke about. Several of members of this committee actually visited communities at the end of February with NRC and some of our partners to see communities that actually the British government and others are supporting in trying to prevent their forcible displacement. But what we've seen over the last several months is continued settler violence, continued demolitions. The demolitions rate in the West Bank this year is by far the highest that we've ever seen. And that is excluding the hundreds of homes in the refugee camps in the north of the West Bank that have been destroyed because the UN simply does not have access to those refugee camps to document the demolition of these homes. But what we've seen in terms of displacement in the West Bank is unprecedented since 1967. We are particularly concerned as attention turns to Iran and Israel that not only will Gaza be forgotten, but that these vulnerable communities in the West Bank will be forgotten. And we've already seen and received reports of settler attacks over the course of the weekend against many of these communities. And we know that these are triggers that will lead to forced displacement of Palestinians. In the aftermath of October 7th, we saw the Israeli settlers go on a rampage throughout the West Bank, with communities attacked, communities displaced, many communities just erased from the map. And as this is ongoing, we are watching the West Bank disappear as Israeli settlements continue to grow. Just a couple of weeks ago, the community Mughayr Adair had an illegal Israeli settlement outpost established right adjacent to the community. And due to the harassment and violence that community experienced, the entire community was forcibly displaced. Just a few days later, we saw that settlers set up another outpost close to Ras Ain El Auja, in the north of the Jordan Valley. This is a community that members of this committee visited at the end of February. And we know that outpost has been established as a means of applying additional pressure and coercing this population to flee. And so while we know that this two-state solution conference that was scheduled for this week has been delayed, it's important for states who purport to support a two-state solution to ensure that there is land left for Palestinians to have their state. And we can't turn our eyes away as this ongoing pressure to displace Palestinians continues, whether it's the Palestinians who are being displaced over and over and over again in Gaza, pushed from place to place, deprived of basic necessities, or it's the Palestinian communities in the West Bank, in the refugee camps, in the Bedouin and herder communities in Area C. We must ensure that these communities are protected, and we need more than words to protect them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We've got a number of questions, and what I want to do in the time available is to see if we can get through as many as we can. Thank you very much for your informative and eloquent answers. If we can, as we rattle through the other questions, perhaps not everybody will be able to answer every question, but in order to, for the sake of time, let's make sure that we get through as many as we can. I know that Phil wanted to ask about children.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to ask Dr. Haj-Hassan, off the back of your testimony as to how extensive the destruction has been of medical facilities in Gaza, I read this morning that the United Nations is reporting that more than 2,700 children under the age of 5 were diagnosed with acute malnutrition only in May. What impact is the destruction having on children, in particular in Gaza? And if you're able to speak to the West Bank as well, I'd be very grateful.
Yeah, sure. My personal testimony in the experience in the last year and a half has been in Gaza, but I did teach in the West Bank in the past. Perhaps one of the other speakers would be more qualified to speak about children in the West Bank. But for children in the Gaza Strip, over the past 19 months, they've been killed and maimed at unprecedented rates every single day. And I'm sure many of you have heard this before. This has made Gaza the largest cohort of pediatric amputees, home to the largest cohort of pediatric amputees in known history. And so it's no surprise that the very organizations that serve to protect children, like UNICEF, have described Gaza as the most dangerous place to be a child, and as well as a graveyard for thousands of children. And others have described it as a war on children. I can tell you, just walking through the intensive care unit where I worked, maybe that would be the best way to illustrate this. I can tell you that the last week I was there, in bed 1, we had a 12-month-old that came in early morning on March 18th with multiple bowel injuries, injury to her chest. She was on life support when we took her off the ventilator. She survived. She kept crying, "Mama, mama, mama." Her mother was killed in the same attack that critically injured her. In the bed next to her, we had a baby that was a few months old who had been waiting to be evacuated for weeks. And as you know, medical evacuations have almost completely come to a halt. There's just a trickle that are able to leave with the support of certain governments. And without evacuation and proper diagnostic and therapeutic care, she will probably die too, if she hasn't died already. Bed 3, we had Sham, 5 or 6 years old. She had injuries to her bowel, liver, spleen. They had to remove her spleen, diaphragm. She had shrapnel going in one side of her brain and out the other, giving her a stroke on the other side of her body. And Sham's mother and father were injured. When her mother finally came to visit her in the ICU, she said, "Please tell me the truth. I lost all my other daughters in the same attack, and I want to know if Sham will survive too." In the bed next to Sham was Yusuf. Yusuf's 5 or 6 years old, multiple injuries to his legs, including severing of one of the main arteries. He almost bled to death. He required chest compressions, so CPR twice in the operating room, and ultimately survived, at least till when I left. But the surgeons didn't think he would be able to keep his lower extremities. Just for context, and kind of in line with what Shaina was saying, a lot of the expertise and education has been a target of this military campaign. So a lot of the specialists in Gaza have now been killed. And amongst the 2 sort of complex orthopedic surgeons in Gaza, one was tortured to death and the other is in Israeli prison. So the type of expertise that's needed to care for children like Yusuf, you don't only need the space, you also need the expertise. And I know, for example, I was meant to go in with a pediatric orthopedic surgeon from the UK who had been in Gaza just a year prior on a mission with the same NGO, and she was denied entry with me, as was the other complex orthopedic surgeon from Kuwait that was supposed to go in with the same team. So I'm not sure if Yusuf was able to keep his legs, but I could go on and on, bed by bed. The bed next to him was a child we think probably had cystic fibrosis, but we didn't have ability to test him. He was very ill on a ventilator, and normally he would have been cared for at the Rantisi subspecialty hospital, where the over 100 pediatric cases of cystic fibrosis in Gaza would have been cared for. But as I mentioned, Rantisi was besieged, it was occupied by the Israeli military, and only now have Palestinians begun to rebuild the parts of the hospital that they're able to, and to provide some of the services. But the chest specialist who I met in Gaza told me that of the over 100 cases of children with cystic fibrosis, they only accounted for 10. And we had to take in one of the essential drugs that the children with cystic fibrosis need because there's no more of that drug in Gaza. And also, following on from what Shaina was saying and what Rohan and Anna were saying before, supplies in Gaza are very difficult to come by, and the restrictions are random and at times very bizarre. Healthcare workers who go in often have their own medications confiscated. So it's really hard to be able to do your job when you do not have the basic tools and medications that you need to care for this population. So I'm giving you an example of the first 4 or 5 beds of the ICU when I left to sort of paint a picture of what children are experiencing. Just to mention that last child with cystic fibrosis or likely cystic fibrosis was 8 years old and weighed 18 kilograms. So very stunted, very malnourished. And this was in March. We're now several months later of complete blockade on the Gaza Strip. There are children that are dying of malnutrition. And as you mentioned, multiple organizations very concerned with the rates of malnutrition in the Gaza Strip amongst children. So in addition to children not having access to the specialized pediatric care that they need, not having access to the nutrition that they need, to the shelter that they need, everything else that's indispensable to the safeguarding and care of children has come under attack. Over 90% of Gaza's schools, all of Gaza's universities, what future have we left for these children? All of Gaza's medical schools, which would have produced the next generation of doctors, when we have so many doctors who've spent 10, 20 years investing in their education and training, have now been killed in an instant. So the reality for children is very grim. They're being injured, maimed, orphaned, and starved. And I just want to plead with everybody here, because when I was in Gaza last year, I remember being in the emergency department and having children laid on the floor in the yellow area, because the red triage area where we're supposed to take care of critical patients was so full. We had patients on the floor everywhere. And these children would be laid on the floor, limp, lifeless, and we would declare them dead immediately. And the ones that we don't declare dead would be fighting for one of the few intensive care beds that were available in a hospital that didn't have a pediatric intensive care unit, but whose adult intensive care unit was almost completely filled with injured and maimed children. This was last year. I remember thinking to myself, wow, this must be the worst it could possibly get. Something is going to change. We're 2 months away from the ICJ ruling on plausible genocide with provisional measures. Something will change. And it hasn't. And that's a frightening reality, to go back 1 year later, to see some of the most horrific crimes being committed in front of our eyes, to know that Aline, the 7-month-old niece of one of my colleagues, was brought to the intensive care unit, now the only survivor of her family, with eyelashes that are burned, hair that are burned, and skin that reeks of the weapons provided by Western nations, including the United Kingdom. To know that after a year of what I thought would be the absolute worst this would possibly get, it's only gotten worse. And I know we're meant to keep the answer short, but just one last point. In the last 10 days that I was in Gaza, when Israel broke the ceasefire agreement, at the time, UNICEF reported that they were killing and maiming about 100 children every single day. So I was trying to care for those patients in the ICU. Meanwhile, in that same period, the Israeli military shelled a UN team, killing and maiming members of it in the same 10 days. Bombed the ICRC offices, directly shelled our hospital while we were in it with a drone strike, as I mentioned earlier, leveled the only subspecialty cancer hospital in the Gaza Strip, killed multiple Palestinian journalists while international journalists are still not let into the Gaza Strip. And you might recall this because it it is one of the few amongst many atrocities that got global media attention. But they also executed at close range 15 rescue workers that were desperately trying to rescue the wounded in Rafah, and then buried them in a mass grave along with their vehicles. This is 1 year after I thought things couldn't get worse. This is 14 months after the ICJ ruling on plausible genocide.
Thank you. Can I move on to Alex?
Thank you. I wanted to ask about the new humanitarian mechanism, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation that's been set up in Gaza after the blockade. We've heard numerous criticisms of the situation, not least the long distances that Gazans are required to walk to reach the place, and the many incidents we've seen in recent days of civilians being killed queuing for food. But I thought it would be very helpful for the committee to hear directly what the impact of this new mechanism is on the people that you're working with in Gaza. And maybe, Anna, if we could start with MSF.
Thank you. It's difficult to overstate at what point this is neither a humanitarian enterprise nor a system. This is basically lethal chaos. Previous to the establishment of this so-called system, and while there was food available to do so, also an important point, there were perhaps 400 to 500 community-level points at which people could obtain food. Kitchens providing hot meals, bakeries, most of which have been supported by international efforts for the last 19 months. There are now 4. That is where you could get food. And in order to reach those places, so the amount of food given out per day is largely arbitrary. In order to reach there, you are asked to move into places where there are military operations actively ongoing, either very close or literally over the queuing areas. Most of the corridors which have been created have been done by means of berms, so you're sort of walking down a cutting. You can't actually see what's to each side. And then there is an entry part where there are fences, and then people must wait for what? We're not quite sure. To receive food, which is handed out in some cases literally by hurling boxes to a crowd of people. I'm sure my colleagues have also worked on actual distributions. I certainly have, and this is not how you do it. This is not how you ensure that people receive what they need to survive. In terms of what is being given out, these are dry rations only. There's no clean water. There's no cooking fuel. There has been no cooking gas enter Gaza since March 2nd. People are cooking on wooden pallets which have been broken up, or plastic which has been salvaged from rubbish tips, or cardboard boxes which have been turned up. Or kerosene, which is causing a large number of the burns that we see in our burn units. So there is nothing humanitarian about this system. I referred earlier to the International Committee for the Red Cross Field Hospital in Rafah. They run a 65-bed surgical hospital. They have had more patients since the opening of this so-called system than they have cumulatively since the beginning of the war and the opening of that hospital. It cannot be a system which so systematically exposes people to a level of lethal and life-altering risk. It is shameful. And the worst thing about it is that the reason which has been offered for this is to prevent, deviation and theft of humanitarian aid by Hamas or by allied so-called hostile forces. I can speak for MSF in this. We have never lost material in a systematic way. It would be impossible in any setting to avoid a certain amount of theft. We're not going to pretend otherwise. But we have seen nowhere near the kind of theft or deviation of our goods that has been offered as the pretext for this. I would like to also point out that Israel has also never offered any evidence of this deviation. It is a straw man, which it is a specious and cynical positionment to undermine a humanitarian system which was actually functioning. Our biggest problem for the entirety of this war has not been deviation of our supplies once it is inside Gaza. It has been getting it into Gaza due to the systematically imposed restrictions and the largely arbitrary rules which are placed along this. I'm going to keep it brief, but in the last week we have had X-ray equipment rejected. We have had sterilising equipment over a certain capacity rejected. So we're allowed to bring in sterilisers up to 35 litres, but not over. We're running trauma hospitals. In the past, during the course of this war, on the so-called dual-use items list, so these are the items which are regarded by the Israeli authorities as potentially providing an asset to the enemy, it has included in the last 19 months donkeys and paper, as well as things like tent poles, which Shaina referred to, as well as medical equipment, as well as parts for generators or such things. So this is the level of restriction that we are dealing with. The problem is not once we get into Gaza, the problem is getting stuff into Gaza in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good. Afra, do you have a question?
I think it's been answered, so that's fine. Thank you.
You're waving at me, Uma. Oh, sorry. Can I just, Richard, I think you wanted to ask about the law.
Yes, please. I would like to ask, please, about the targeting of hospitals by the IDF. And I wondered whether, Rohan, direct this question at you. It's about international humanitarian law and the protected status of hospitals. You'll know that under international humanitarian law, a hospital loses its protection if there are acts that are so-called harmful to the enemy that are being conducted from that hospital. And you will have heard the Israeli Defense Forces say that that is the basis for them striking hospitals. Can I ask, have you encountered any evidence where combatants are being sheltered or military operations are being engaged in from hospitals?
Thank you for this question. It's an important one, and I would obviously defer to colleagues who've been inside the hospitals as well. We're not aware of, certainly in the level that Israel has accused, or any in the cases of the emergency medical teams that we have been sending into Gaza, of any incidents of militant activity inside those hospitals. There is consistent testimony from emergency medical teams, our own and plenty of others on the ground, that they haven't witnessed that sort of activity. And also Israel has provided no concrete evidence over many of its claims against hospitals. And there have, of course, been numerous investigations by independent news sources, by human rights organisations, by others, finding Israel's claims to be misleading. I'll give you a couple of examples. In November 2023, Human Rights Watch, looking into some of the Israeli claims, concluded that despite the Israeli military's claims on November the 5th, 2023, of, quote, Hamas's cynical use of hospitals, no evidence put forward would justify depriving hospitals and ambulances of their protected status under IHL. Zoom forward to December the 11th, 2024, The Guardian quoted the ICC prosecutor, Andrew Cayley, who of course was the former UK military chief prosecutor, as saying that Israel's allegations of military activities in hospitals has been, quote, grossly exaggerated. We need to be able to demonstrate very clearly what the level of military presence was, if at all, in these hospitals, because I think we've been misled about that in the press. Only just recently, on the 15th of May, Sky News, and I'd be very happy to share their investigation, investigated the accusations against the European Gaza Hospital, which Dr. Tanya was speaking about before, and found that the basis of Israel's claims was entirely false. as well as this issue of protected status, Israel's actions are also bound by the obligations of distinction, proportionality, and of course precaution in attack as part of IHL. Now, as you have heard, the health system in Gaza has been systematically dismantled, clinic by clinic, hospital by hospital. It is being destroyed in a way that can only be inferred to be intentional as part of the elimination of the basic survival needs of the population. Those hospitals that are put out of service, when Palestinians and others are able to go back to them, what do they find? They find equipment that has been smashed and shot up. They find facilities that have been burnt out by the soldiers who have used that hospital as a command and control centre. They find eyewitnesses who have witnessed field executions. And in the cases of Shifa Hospital and Nasser Hospital, they find mass graves of patients and doctors and others, people buried in mass graves when the Israeli military withdraw. Now, these allegations are very serious ones. We take them seriously, but note that Israel has not allowed anybody from the ICC, independent human rights investigators, or international journalists to come in and verify their claims. And so, I should emphasize that MAP has been documenting attacks on Palestinian healthcare for more than a decade, going all the way back to their attacks in 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014. Over that period of time, 147 cases of hospitals and clinics being damaged and destroyed, 145 health workers injured and killed. In the 2018 Great March of Return, 845 health workers killed. Nobody has ever been held account for any attack on Palestinian healthcare that we are aware of over that period of time. Not a single soldier, not a single commander. And so I should just reference, and I would be very happy to share it with the committee, the independent UN Commission of Inquiry, which concluded in October 2024 that Israel has, quote, deliberately killed, wounded, arrested, detained, mistreated and tortured medical personnel and targeted medical vehicles and facilities as part of a concerted policy to destroy the healthcare system in Gaza. The Commission of Inquiry concluded that in doing so, Israeli forces have committed war crimes and the crime against humanity of extermination.
Can I just ask, is it possible that those healthcare workers are being indirectly targeted rather than directly targeted? Is it possible that they are, and I hate this euphemism, collateral damage in what is an attack on sick or wounded combatants who are no longer taking part in the hostilities?
It is not possible to credibly conclude that Israel is meaningfully acting in good faith with regards to its obligations under IHL. I think it would stretch credibility far too far if you were to look at the fact that now more than half of all hospitals in Gaza are completely out of service and the rest of them are only partially functioning. A military that is acting in good faith with regards to IHL would not burn out a hospital, would not destroy, completely explode the Turkish-Palestinian Friendship Hospital, the only dedicated cancer hospital in Gaza, would not, as Dr. Tanya shared earlier, would not have cleared out the staff from the Al-Nasser intensive care unit up in Gaza City when there were Palestinian babies on the beds and denied them care. There is no credible way that we conclude that this is in good faith. And read in the round of everything else that we see, I mean, I have in front of me, and I'd be very happy to share this, a list of every single attack on hospital and displacement order against them since the ceasefire ended. And just to give you a few examples, I'll just choose 1 week in May. 15th and 19th of May, Al-Awda Hospital in North Gaza is damaged due to airstrikes. 16th and the 18th of May, the Indonesian hospital in North Gaza comes under repeated Israeli attacks and suffers structural damage. Same time, 17th and 19th of May, the Al-Aqsa hospital in Deir al-Balah, direct damage when an Israeli strike impacted its surroundings. Then the next day, Jordanian Field Hospital in Khan Yunis. Then the next day, the Kamal Adwan Hospital in northern Gaza, the Nasser Medical Complex, etc. This is 1 week. So I think it stretches credibility to say that this is indirect, this is targeted. It's the same as denying people the very means that they need to survive, their food, their education, their shelter. We have to read the policy in the round, and we have to take credibly the conclusions of Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, independent UN experts, the majority of scholars around the world who focus on issues such as atrocity crimes and genocide, that that's what Israel is doing.
Madam Chair, if I may.
If you're very quick, because I've still got 4 or 5 more questions and we've only got 20 or so minutes
I will speak
left.
to the number of incidents that MSF has experienced. In the course of this war, we, that is MSF staff and patients, we have been forced to leave at least 18 different health structures because of threats, destruction or proximity of ground operations. And those health structures have been destroyed. We have endured 50 violent incidents against ourselves. Those include airstrikes against hospitals where we were physically present at the time, tank shelling against clinics where we were physically present at the time, tank shells being fired at deconflicted shelters for our own staff, killing our own staff, offensives into medical centres, and convoys that are fired upon. We have lost 11 of our colleagues in the course of this war, and with due consideration for that word, we have been lucky compared to some.
Okay, now I understand why you wanted to give that testimony. Thank you.
And Madam Chairman, just to add one sentence to that.
Okay, one sentence.
In terms of targeting healthcare workers, there are hundreds that have been detained by the Israeli military, and with reports of torture in detention. And when I asked them personally after they were released why they were detained, they said, we get called by you, the one in the scrubs, come here. You, the one in the white coat, come here. So they feel that they're specifically targeted for their profession.
Thanks, Chair. Shaina, could I ask you, the UK government is currently reducing its aid budget, but has said that it wants to protect, in particular, humanitarian support in Gaza and the West Bank during that. What's your expectation as to what British humanitarian assistance will look like over the coming year, and what would you like to see the UK government do more of to ensure that aid gets through?
Well, first of all, while of course funding is needed, and as of mid-June, only 16% of the UN's flash appeal has been funded, with many core sectors like shelter, like protection, like water, sanitation, and hygiene that are severely, severely under-resourced. So of course we need additional financial support, and we hope that the UK government will actually increase its flexible funding for frontline humanitarian partners, including NGOs, and call on other donor states, call on their peers to help close this gap. And we need to have multi-year unearmarked funding for our operations to be prioritized. But right now, as I think all of us have shared, our biggest issue is that we have lots of aid right now that is waiting to get into Gaza. We have that aid prepared, sitting in warehouses, sitting on trucks, accruing demurrage fees, which is wasteful of UK taxpayers' money and wasteful of the limited resources that we as humanitarian agencies have. And so what we really need is a concerted effort from the UK, working with peer countries to put the pressure on Israel to ensure that our aid will get in. We are pleased to see that the UK has rejected the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and what that organization is trying to do, but we need more help from the UK in order to get in the aid that we and traditional humanitarian partners that adhere to the principles of neutrality, impartiality, and independence have in order to, we need your help in getting our materials in and in having safe access. And so in order to do that, we need additional pressure and we need actions. We need there to be consequences when Israel fails to abide by its obligations under international law as the occupying power to facilitate humanitarian assistance. We have coming out probably at the end of this month or early July an ICJ advisory opinion on Israel's obligations in the occupied Palestinian territory as it pertains to humanitarian assistance and the facilitation of humanitarian aid. And so it's essential that the UK and other governments, when that decision comes out, that they ensure that those obligations are being met. We need to see enforcement of the 2024 ICJ advisory opinion that found that Israel's occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, is unlawful, and to take steps to ensure that the occupation, rather than being entrenched, is actually dismantled and removed. And we know that you guys are an important leader in principled humanitarian work, and we hope that you will, along with peer countries, continue to apply pressure on Israel and take meaningful steps to ensure that obligations are being met. And I'd be happy to follow up with you about what some of those specific recommendations would be. Thank you.
We would like those, and if you would send them in, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Could I ask if any of the other witnesses have anything to add to this? Because I think Shaina's point touches on one of the sort of real horrific things about this, which is that the shelters, the medicine, the food is kilometres away from the people who need it. What more would you like to see Britain do? Specific actions to make sure that it does get through?
Sure, I would like to. I mean, I would endorse everything that's just been said, and I think that, as you've heard, I think the frame of reference here should have been set for the UK government in terms of planning what its action will be, all the way back in January 2024, when the International Court of Justice concluded that there was a plausible case that genocide is being committed, and made a number of recommendations, and I'll read you a few of them. Its provisional measures demanded that Israel, of course, stop causing bodily harm and mental harm to members of the Palestinian group in Gaza, stop inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. And then later on, of course, in March, demanded that it take all necessary and effective measures to ensure full cooperation with the United Nations and unhindered provision at scale of all concerned of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance, including food, water, electricity, fuel, shelter, and etc., etc. None of these provisional measures has been implemented. And so the UK's obligation to prevent genocide was primed at that point. The ICJ had said this is a plausible case, and since then absolutely none of this has been implemented. So essentially the point that's already been shared is that there need to be effective and urgent countermeasures to ensure that those responsible for example, using starvation as a weapon of war, denying all of us as aid agencies safe access, for attacking aid operations frequently and repeatedly on the ground, they need to know that failing to comply with these measures will have consequences. And I think that the UK government, on recognising what the ICJ said at that point, should have conducted a root and branch review of its relationship with Israel, diplomatic, military, economic, and try to identify any points within that relationship where there is potential complicity or potential enabling of these sorts of actions. And so everything that we have talked about today so far is enabled by impunity, and it's only through accountability that this ends.
I want to be able to get the question that Abdesam wants to ask, and Uma's. And we also have the question about the 80% tax, but that might be better to leave to, perhaps if you were able to write to us.
Correspondence, yeah.
Yeah, which is the Knesset legislation imposing an 80% tax on foreign government funding to Israeli foreign society organisations, and that's obviously something which is of huge importance. But if we were able to get that in writing, I'll go straight to Abdesam.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Apologies if this has been covered earlier on. I know that we initially, Dr. Tanya, you referenced the impact of the war on children. I'd like, if I may, to take it back to the impact of women and the whether you can speak to the impact on health and fertility services in Gaza and where women are able to get the support needed, especially in fertility care. That's for you, Dr. Tanya.
Yeah, sure. Someone else might be better able to talk about this, since I don't treat infertility. But as far as I'm aware, I mean, I know I had several patients where the mom said, I really struggled to conceive this child, where the child is quite injured. And I do know that the main fertility clinic in Gaza was destroyed, and that was part of the UN report that concluded concerns for genocide, based on the intentional destruction of that fertility center with thousands of embryos, as far as I remember. But someone else might be more up to date on the facts. As far as I'm aware, there are no fertility treatments in Gaza at the moment. Everybody's very much in survival mode. I have 2 colleagues who are pregnant and very worried about where they'll deliver their children, given that most of the hospitals in Gaza that would have specialized or would have been good at known for their maternity, obstetrics and gynecology care have been destroyed, including Al Shifa Hospital and the Emirati Field Hospital, the maternity hospital in Rafah. So for those who are pregnant, safe delivery is a concern. And has been very difficult. Nutrition for pregnant mothers has been extremely difficult. But as far as fertility treatments are concerned, I'm afraid I'm not the right person to address that question.
Would that be you, Anna?
I'm afraid I'm about as limited as Dr. Haj-Hassan. It is absolutely one of the casualties among many of specialist services. Without exaggerating, there are basically no specialist medical services running anymore in Gaza. This is scrambling to do basic life-saving and basic primary health care. MSF currently runs 2 maternity units, one in Gaza City, one in Nasser Hospital. So indeed, safe delivery is the first concern at this point rather than safe conception. We also have standard sexual and reproductive health services available at the 6 or 7 primary healthcare clinics where we work, so which includes antenatal care and the normal package. The conditions for maintaining a safe pregnancy or indeed for safe conception are simply not there. People, it's essentially random. What I will say, and Dr. Haj-Hassan just referred to the nutrition status, and referring to your earlier question about malnutrition, is that among the pregnant and lactating women that we see in our primary healthcare cohort, about 15% are malnourished. This is high. That's very high for adults. The malnutrition rate in children is concerning, especially when you consider that Palestine before the war didn't have malnutrition. It just simply isn't a problem. It didn't exist without a comorbidity, so another medical issue as the cause. And so the rates that we have seen, while very difficult to track with the mobility of the population, are already concerning. But in adults, that is indicative of people favouring the children. In meals, we have a lot of anecdotal evidence of adults saying, well, I'm eating once a day, and what else I get is going to the children. It is simply impossible to imagine that fertility or conception rates would be maintained with that level of adult malnutrition, but more than that, and it's not something that we take figures on.
Could I?
If I may jump in just a little bit, not medical related, but in terms of also the experience of women, both in Gaza and in the West Bank. In terms of Gaza, some of the most vulnerable households are female-headed households. And as we think and look that the only way for people to get food right now is making these long treks to these distribution sites operated by the GHF, it means that women who are alone with their children are unable to make those journeys, or it's quite dangerous for them, potentially putting their children at risk of being orphaned. The multiple displacements and the fact that communities in Gaza have basically disappeared and people are displaced among strangers is also putting women and girls in vulnerable situations and at risk of sexual exploitation and sexual abuse. And so these are also issues not as heavily reported on, but issues that are deeply impacting women. And if I may, for just 1 minute, mention the impact of displacement on the women in the West Bank. The communities that we work with tell us how difficult it is for the women, in particular when they are displaced. There's a community called the Wadi Sikh community, and Foreign Minister Lamy actually met with this community last year, and they were forcibly transferred in the aftermath of October 7th. The community leader, Abu Bashar, he and his wife and their children have been forcibly displaced an additional 3 times since October 7th. And his wife, in addition to dealing with the trauma that has been inflicted upon these children due to repeated settler attacks, the disruption in their educations, are isolated. They are living alone without their families, extended families, without their communities. And what we are seeing is basically this disintegration of the fabric of Palestinian society as a result of ongoing violence, as a result of ongoing displacement. And these are issues that are persistent in all of the communities that we work with in the West Bank, where women are isolated. They're unable to go about their daily work, gardening, tending to fields, picking up their children, because it is simply unsafe for them to move, let alone the women in Gaza who are living for fear of their lives and unsure if they're going to be able to feed their families from one day to the next.
Thank you. Uma.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for giving evidence today. It's been really harrowing to listen, and can't imagine what it's been like for you on the ground. You've described the situations to do with the aid blockade, but also the medical supplies as well. I have two questions related. One, what will happen if this blockade remains in place in terms of medical supplies and what that means for people on the ground? And two, what practical measures can the UK now take? We are parliamentarians around this table. What can we push the government for? Dr. Haj-Hassan, I'll start with you, perhaps.
I mean, even in March, when there was a so-called ceasefire, I say so-called because at the hospital we were still receiving fresh injured patients from Israeli military violence. But even during that period, the healthcare system was really struggling. We didn't have enough of the supplies that we needed. A lot of the subspecialty services, as I mentioned, weren't available, were being provided with great difficulty. I visited the European Gaza Hospital, for example, that had taken over cancer care at the time, and they were struggling to dispose of chemotherapy safely because you need safe equipment to dispose of chemotherapy drugs. I visited the Rantisi Paediatric Hospital, where some colleagues were trying to set up an intensive care unit, as well as another intensive care unit in a non-governmental hospital, the Patient Friendship Benevolence Society, that's supported by MAP UK. And I heard these pediatricians who provide intensive care in Gaza talk about not having enough ventilators. And when I explored further, it turns out there are 33 ventilators waiting in Israel to enter Gaza. They've been waiting for months, that UNICEF purchased and has been struggling to get them in. I confirmed just 2 weeks ago that those ventilators have still not been allowed into Gaza. These are ventilators for children that would allow us to expand the number of intensive care beds. So this is all, again, during ceasefire period and during a period where aid was initially getting in. These essential medical items were prohibited from entering. Now we're in a situation where the drugs that were used most often when I was in Gaza are now running out of stock. I spoke to the director of pediatrics at the Nasser hospital, was it last week, I think? And he was telling me that they ran out of baby formula, that they no longer had something called intravenous immunoglobulin that we were using to treat the many patients that were presenting with something called acute flaccid myelitis, so children that come in paralyzed for unknown reasons, but sometimes for some of the diagnoses, intravenous immunoglobulin can reverse that paralysis. Unfortunately, we no longer have the testing capabilities, the imaging capabilities, or the drugs to treat some of the things that we could diagnose if we had the diagnostic capabilities, but they'd run out of intravenous immunoglobulin, as well as multiple antibiotics since the period where I was in Gaza. So I can speak kind of just from personal experience, but perhaps MAP or MSF spokespeople can speak more generally about operations and medical supply blockade.
Thank you. Maybe Rohan, I'll go to you.
Yeah, perhaps to focus on the question about practical things that the UK can do. Hamish Faulkner, the Minister for the Middle East, obviously last week was in the House and was speaking about the sanctions that the UK had imposed on two Israeli ministers, an important forward step. He said in relation to question on aid that we are doing all we can to ensure that food and medicine reach children and all those in need in Gaza. And I have to say, unfortunately, I wish that that was true, but it simply isn't. As we've said previously, the obligation to both legal and moral to respond to a situation of mass atrocities, extermination, starvation as a weapon of war, and as has been concluded by human rights experts and groups, genocide, means that the UK should have reviewed all relations in light of that. And there are a few things that I think, and that we as MAP think that should have been imposed long ago. First and foremost, it'll be no surprise, we've been calling it for more than a year, an immediate arms embargo on Israel and a suspension of military cooperation. In particular, a suspension of the provision of F-35 parts, amongst the most lethal equipment that's used by Israel to kill men, women and children. Secondly, supporting meaningful accountability for all violations of international law. Those responsible for starving people, for ethnically cleansing people and from bombing Gaza out of existence should know that there will be consequences for that. Thirdly, using all available means to enforce a ceasefire and ensure aid can flow around Gaza safely. And failure to comply with the ICJ's provisional measures earlier, as I said, should be met with meaningful and impactful countermeasures, diplomatic, economic levers and others. And also the UK's basis, its legal basis should be a little bit clearer. We've been waiting for nearly a year now for the UK to publish its response to the ICJ's advisory opinion on the legality of the occupation. Now, that advisory opinion concluded that the court considers the duty of distinguishing dealings with Israel between its own territory and the occupied Palestinian territory encompasses, inter alia, that third states must take steps to prevent trade or investment relations that assist the maintenance of an illegal situation created by Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. It's pretty clear, but we're still waiting for the response to this. So across the board, there are practical things that the government could do. And I should just briefly say that though there have been important steps, they are not digging deeply enough into the policy toolkit. So it did resume funding for UNRWA, very welcome, but has done nothing to meaningfully hold to account those people responsible for killing UNRWA staff in their literal hundreds. It has stated its support for international law and increased the strength of its rhetoric. However, as I mentioned, it hasn't published its response to the ICJ advisory opinion. It has suspended some 30 arms exports, comprising less than 10% of the total exports, but F-35 parts continue to flow. It has imposed sanctions on some settler leaders and, of course, 2 ministers for extremist rhetoric, but continues to allow the import of goods from illegal settlements into the UK and allows UK companies to do business in those settlements. So what we're asking for is to dig far deeper into that policy toolkit, as the UK has rightly done in other situations of severe violations of international law, including, of course, Russia's actions in Ukraine, and take seriously the warnings of atrocities that we and every other reasoned observer on the ground are making.
Thank you.
Perhaps I could complete the contribution of Dr. Haj-Hassan from her personal experience and expand it to the macro experience in terms of what is going to be the consequence if the actual blockade is not lifted. The simple answer is that the quality and the quantity of care provided will dwindle and stop. We are already the level of care being provided either in terms of quantity, in the terms of the number of beds available, the number of specialists or general practitioners available, the number of structures available proportional to the number of population, is already subpar by a long way. We are talking essentially about 6 hospitals which are providing anything near a level of function that is needed for the local population. And that's quite an exemption, that we would not normally regard these hospitals as acting up to standard, but compared to the average, they are in the forefront. We are already, as Dr. Haj-Hassan referred to, at sort of critical pre-rupture levels for some key things, including abdominal compresses. They're quite useful if you're doing war surgery. That's what's going to stop your bleeding and enable people to actually have life-threatening wounds treated. We are limited on the number of external fixator kits. Mm-hmm. That's what you need when you've got lower limb injuries by gunshot and you're doing orthopedic surgery and you want to stabilize it. It's also what you need if you want to limit and to a minimum the number of interventions that, for example, a paediatric patient is going to need over the course of their lifetime. If those wounds are not treated as best they can at the beginning, you are simply adding on 10 or 20 years worth of procedures over their lifetime because they were not handled at the beginning. We're already not able to do that. So we are, I would say, weeks away from having to make choices about the quality of care. So that means using second, third, or fourth line choices instead of first line choices. We're already making second line choices, let's be very clear. And then we're going to have to make the choice to stop providing care because there won't be any care that you can provide. We won't be able to make reasoned diagnostics. We will not be able to take in charge what we have been able to diagnose. We will not be able to maintain a course of treatment for either acute or chronic injury or disease. That is the consequence.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Unless the committee have any other pressing questions, I think we've raised the issue of the 80% tax, which would be really good to hear if anybody has anything. And I know that there have been offers when you've been giving evidence to say if you want to hear anything more that you'd give it in writing, and we'd appreciate that as well. We want to thank you very much for your time today, for your passion and your dedication, and thank you very much for sharing your testimony with us. If you have any further thoughts occurs to you after this session, please do write to the committee with any further thoughts. And with thanks of all of us, I'm closing this session. Order.